and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today, Anton Jägar returns to talk about the development of the sociologist Robert Putnam and how prophetic and depressing um, his his book Bowling Alone has tended to be. We are basing this largely off of an article Anton wrote for Jacobin, but we'll be going into some more context that's beyond the article. So, how are you doing today, Anton?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. I think it's always good to discuss a topic which I think is underappreciated in its importance.
Yeah. So I read Bowling Alone in 2001, which was about a barely under a decade from when it came out. I believe it came out, what, 1992?
No. It came out in the end of the 90s. It was
Okay,
pretty
so late
recent when you
90s.
read it. Yeah. I think its eventual publication date might even have been in 2000, but there
Yes.
is an issue with editions insofar as they did reissue it afterwards.
So I think maybe I got 1992 in my head because I've looked at the American survey, the survey on American life a lot recently. Kind of interestingly, and I think it's data comparison I think is 1990 to now. Um, and it seems like Putnam was right. But I think one of the things that your article kind of pointed out to me is he's not just right for the US. Like that Europe actually follows pretty similar trends, and we may be seeing even similar trends in like Latin America and Asia. So what what is Putnam's thesis for our listeners who haven't read that book?
So I'm gonna give a very, let's say, anecdotal summary that then zooms out into the broader conceptual argument. So the reason that the book is called Bowling Alone, I think many people will be familiar with this argument mainly as a meme, is that Putnam looks at statistics when it comes to bowling league and bowling alley attendance in the 1990s and 1980s, and he notices a curious pattern. Namely, more and more people are going to bowling leagues, so attendance is actually increasing, but at the same time, there is a steep decline and a disbanding of all kinds of league bowling. So collective sports are becoming much more difficult. And his explanation for this is, how is it that people are still going to bowl? Well, it's because they're bowling alone. And he uses this anecdotal piece of evidence as a heuristic or an analytical key to explain a wide range of phenomena, from disengagement with parties, from the decline of neighborhood associations, to the crisis of certain forms of church life, to also the fall in union membership, as indicators of a general crisis of sociality, or sort of general crisis of the social that overtakes not only developed Western nations, but nations all across the globe at the close of the 20th century. And it's backed up by a lot of data. It's not particularly pleasant to read, and its analytical apparatus is what you could call one of bourgeois sociology. But unfortunately, and this is why I was willing to make a conditional defense of it, it is still one of the few books that actually talks about this phenomenon as a total social phenomenon and not just limited to one institution. We have very rich and I think more robust work on, for example, the crisis of parties. We have a lot of really good work on the crisis of unions. But Putnam is specific in that he actually situates this crisis on a much more broader translateral dimension. And in that sense, unfortunately, it's the only book we have to start a conversation about what the crisis of the social might actually mean.
So Putnam is kind of interesting to me, partly because he was more or less considered on the left liberal spectrum of bourgeois politics and sociology. Um, Although at this point, are there still conservative sociologists? I haven't met one in a long
This is a good
time.
question. Yeah. I mean, Charles Murray, if he sees himself as a sociologist.
Right, and that's kind of it. Um, and I think Bowling Alone kind of put his name on the map as far as popular culture goes. Um, but it's interesting that you would think that maybe communists would be interested in figuring out like why, for example, mass politics seems impossible, not just the decline of parties, which I think confuses Americans because um, party membership in the United States is nominal. So um, we think about, well, partisanship has increased recently. I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any social responsibility or even like a set of beliefs that you actually have to maintain. You don't have to meet with a group. No one's calling you to like do anything. So the nominal partisanship is not really what we mean. And with unions, there's a whole lot of evidence. One of the things that Americans used to push back on Putnam against is they used to cite churches, which again, churches seem to be growing, particularly in the megachurch form in the 90s and aughts. But more recent data actually says that religiosity in general has decreased, but actual church attendance has plummeted to the ground. So even more than the decline in religiosity of PushPull stats in America would indicate. And maybe as far as church attendance, we look a lot more like Europe than we admit. So I think even someone like JD Vance talks about how like there's a lot of nominal religiosity in America, but like no one's going to church, and the stats actually do back him up. So
No, he's very right about this, and it is reminiscent of what Christopher Lasch already said in the 1990s about the replacement of religion with therapy. So he says increase of a latent sense of religiosity, but no real denominational commitments. So the institutional infrastructure behind this religiosity is very diffuse and very weak. But that doesn't mean that churches can't proliferate as sort of providers or suppliers of meaning. And I think sometimes it's not just about meaning, but with the wealth gospel, it's actually just entrepreneurial advice. You see this very clearly in Brazil, which in contrast to the US has a much longer and older Catholic tradition, where the contrast between how that evangelical religious landscape looks like and what the older church, the Catholic Church, looks like, just signals that we're talking about a very different type of religiosity. It's less institutionally articulate, it's less mediated, it's much more liquid and much more individualized than anything you get in the older Catholic bastions. To return to the beginning of your question, I think one of the reasons communists, or at least for people further on the left, were hesitant to go along with Putnam or thought the book was not a very productive research program is that one side was just that it had very few or limited discussions of labor. So I looked this up for the article, but it actually doesn't have an index for deindustrialization. And there is very little discussion of potential anti-union laws which were introduced. And at the same time, his causal account of the crisis of civil society is actually pretty narrow. So he does consider a variety of hypotheses, whether it's racist attitudes, desegregation, whether it's sexism, and all these, and he does debunk them quite ably. He also says that the welfare state can't really explain why this crisis of civil society takes off. But then he doesn't actually dig deeper what it was in the 70s and 80s, and mainly, I would say, for example, the capitalist response to the inflationary crisis that actually carried out a controlled demolition of civil society in a way that was not only extremely devastating on the left, but also on the right. So there was a conscious attempt on behalf of elites to decouple themselves from their bases, both on the left and the right. And Putnam never talks about this. And I understand why people on the left might be put off by this, because that doesn't seem a very promising avenue for a materialist explanation of the crisis of civil society. Unfortunately, I think his basic observation is right, and it's up to us to come up with a better causal account of what actually drives this transversal crisis of sociality, which he did rightly see.
yeah, I've heard you talk about the fact that the political left and the political right in America actually both experience this, and in fact, often political leftists think that rightists would talk about their vibrant community, and they actually probably agree with Putnam even more than we do. Um, but that their explanations are more yeah, we blame capitalism, they blame us. Like, basically. um
Yeah.
so whether they call it cultural Marxism or generic liberalism or whatever, secularism, depending, but it does seem like that's the case. But I think a lot of leftists think a lot of right-wing social institutions are more vibrant than they are. I mean, I remember very recently coming up to the reversal of Roe v. Wade, hearing Gloria Steinem go on British radio and say that America was experiencing an evangelical resurgence, and I about fell over laughing because I was like, yeah, I live in Utah, which still actually weirdly does still have some of these institutions, but they're fading. Like we have more civic charity institutions. People still go to church. There's still a lot of, because of that, there's actually probably more here, more intra-class awareness than a lot of other places. Different classes of people interact more. In fact, I've seen stats to the contrary, but that's fading here too. It's just happening slower.
Yes. And I will say that those two explanations are not perfectly equivalent. I think the first had a bit more merits in the idea that we are actually doing it. If only we could do it, that would be impressive.
I've always like, kind of like the way some leftists give all this power to the CAA. I'm always like, man, I wish I could do the crap you attribute to cultural Marxism. Like that implies a competence and a power that I just do not see on our side.
No, there's a dream of agency enclosed in there, which is actually in many ways very interesting. And I do think the right is onto something, that a culture war has been won, or at least parts of the cultural aims of the left have found it easier to etch themselves onto a certain power structure. It's making a virtue out of necessity, but I do think there's been a sort of liberalization of mores and a more tolerant culture on many, many fronts, which was originally the program of the left and which it didn't cause on its own, which also has to do with like broader and deeper socioeconomic trends. And there the right might be onto something, that the left is winning the culture war. But as such, and this was striking in the responses to my piece from people who are on the right, is that they really doubted that the left has done worse in the age of Putnam than the right. To them, they say the right has suffered an even more severe crisis. The atomization which is inflicted on civil society actually cripples the right in a far more profound way. And I found that an extremely suggestive and also puzzling suggestion, because it seemed to imply that maybe we weren't losing after all. But I think what's actually happening, certainly in the last 40 years, is that what you have is a self-driving car with two parties standing next to it, and one party yelling at the other party that they're steering the wheel in the wrong direction, and the other party yelling at the other party saying you're steering the wheel in the wrong direction as well, when it's very clear that this thing now drives itself and it doesn't need that much political steering. There is a kind of automatic subject at play here, which also means that the degree of political mediation or influence that is available to the relative parties has greatly decreased. And I do think this poses more problems on the left than the right, because the benchmark of success for the left is always higher. We live in a capitalist society. If your idea is to overthrow it, well, then you have a de facto disadvantage within that society. But it doesn't mean it generates no massive problems on the right. And if you look at membership, for example, of the British Conservatives or the French Gaullists, or even of the Christian Democrats in Germany, which used to be really vibrant, grand mass parties, even those institutions have experienced a precipitous decline in the last 40 years. And they've been able to cope with this decline better because they can look for wealthy funders much easier, and they were always less reliant on mass politics. But they've always been reliant on mass politics, and it generates really big volatility between voters and elites, even when the right decouples itself from its base.
I think that's interesting when I think about this in terms of maybe what's been called anti-politics or hyper-politics, both. I mean, and one of the interesting things when I read the description of hyper-politics and I read the description of anti-politics, I'm like, well, now I really can't tell the difference between them anyway. Like, people are hyper partisan, but they're not part of any political machines. They're not actively engaged in local politics. They don't know what local politics is, even. I mean, in the United States, it's more probably advanced than in Europe, but in all these places, it seems like if you ask someone what their local Republicans are doing, the average person has no idea. They far know more about like Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia than they would know about someone in Utah, and yet they have no effect on Marjorie Taylor Greene whatsoever. So, to me, when we talk about that, I'm like, well, it's a weirdly apolitical partisanship. Like partisanship is an identity, but it's not really a local politics. Although sometimes it can emerge as such with school board takeovers or whatever. But even those tend to be sporadic and limited. Like they happen, they're real, but even since we've talked about this whole mobilization 2 years ago over CRT, while that's still part of the national discourse, if it didn't happen in the first couple of months, it apparently has not happened. So we haven't seen the expansion of CRT bans and whatnot.
Yeah, I think there are two unique features of the American situation which make the comparative interpretation a bit difficult. The first is the really striking federalization of politics, which has happened in the last 30 years, which probably is a product also of the Reagan and then of the Bush era, which means that you don't only see the decline of local newspapers. People watch a lot more TV, and CNN and MSNBC, for example, don't necessarily, or even Fox, don't talk about issues that are directly pertaining to the local. So there's been a nationalization of American politics that goes hand in hand with this new hyperpartisanship. That means certain forms of local engagement become much more difficult. And the other thing is, of course, that America has never had a proper mass party system. I mean, there were examples which I cite in the piece, such as the populists in the 1880s and 1890s, which did have members. This also held for the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. But after that, and you can even see that in the DSA, which is not officially a political party as such, there's never really been a tradition, which is partly just a product of legal constraints, of committed, lifelong, I would say, semi-involuntary party membership in the US. What I tried to point out in the piece, nonetheless, even if American parties are basically state departments, so they're a weird fusion between cadre and civil servant, where the US is a party state that happens to have two parties. This didn't mean that the parties themselves were not connected to a hinterland of civil society institutions which had a say in how the party was to govern. So if you look at the New Deal Democratic Party, even if you look at the Goldwater Republican Party, there was a landscape behind these shells which still meant that you had an organized civil society that could claim its place within the party. And it actually makes those American parties in a more classical age much closer to the mass parties that Europe did have, where lifelong involuntary partisanship was the rule rather than the exception. So whether you read testimonies of people whose parents were in communist parties in the 50s and 60s, or people whose parents were Christian Democrats, or Catholics, one very striking thing was how prohibitive and how the exit costs were for leaving those institutions. If you were born in a Christian family, the idea that you could go and vote for a Socialist Party, for the Liberal Party, actually made it very difficult because you were so embedded and so constrained within that community, whether it is church service on Sunday, whether it is the union you join, whether it's the association you're part of, whether it is the broader institution that can take care of your children. This meant that the exit costs were very steep. And this even holds for communist parties where you spent your entire life within the Workers' Party, and the party actually had a lot to say on how your private life was structured as well. What you consumed, what you ate, what you read, what you bought were all determined by your party card in many ways. So this is almost like membership of a medieval estate or pillar rather than it is the identity affiliation we've become accustomed to now. What has happened in the last 40 years in Europe, and certainly also in the US, is that that type of engagement has really disappeared. It's become far more temporary, but also the exit costs for leaving whatever a QAnon Facebook group or a BLM street protest are much, much lower. The amount of stigma you have to bear for getting out of there is just incomparable to what people had to bear when they tried to leave in the 50s and 60s. And I think that's the real explanation of the fluidity or the liquidization of political life we're experiencing, is that people are extremely polarized and engaged in many ways, but they're not actually willing to engage in a type of political commitment that will be long term. So it's the outer edge of a political short termism that we hadn't quite recognized before.
I think it's interesting, although the pattern I would argue was always a little different in America, because we had many societies of which there were high exit costs to leave,
Yeah.
but they were not totalizing. So
Yes. Yeah.
so like you would have there'd be a high cost to changing your religion, right?
Oh,
And
definitely. Yeah.
and there'd be high costs for moving from a Democrat to Republican. But those two things were not as clearly aligned as they were in Europe. So for example, the alignment, for all that we think about the 80s and 90s as the kind of heyday of evangelicals becoming politicized and they were a real political power, the evangelical whites being easily identified as Republicans are literally a phenomenon of the last 10 years. So I think that's interesting, but if, for example, the Republican Party tried to survive off of a base of white evangelicals who go to church, they would never win another election. In one sense, in America, it does feel like, yes, we're highly partisan, we're engaged, very similar to Europe. But I find it interesting that Europe seems like us now, that like our fluidity of institutions has kind of become more normal in Europe. It's becoming more normalized in Latin America, etc. And I don't, while I do think internet technologies play a role in this, I don't think they're actually explanatory. I think the trends predate them.
Definitely. Absolutely. So just to get back to the American-European comparison, there's two causal mechanisms we can use to explain this increasing resemblance, or how Europe looks like what the US has always been. The first is just Americanization. So the constitutional structure and the legal setup of a lot of European states has been Americanized, whether it's French socialist parties doing open primaries, whether it's the introduction of these cartel parties rather than these mass parties. So in that sense, Europe is just moving towards America, or what the default American mode. And the other is obviously that both the US and Europe have undergone certain economic trends or forms of restructuring, which heavily incentivize this type of fluid and liquid politics. So the way that elites try to buy consent or try to stabilize their polities means they have to respond to similar pressures. And this means that you just look at the playbook of other elites who are trying to solve this problem, and you increasingly look towards certain examples. And you see this very clearly with the export of American culture wars, is that it's also a way for European elites to find a way of managing or recuperating discontent in a way that might not endanger certain materialist wagers, etc., etc. Then further, when it comes to the sorry, what was the second question again? This was about
why would both Europe and Latin America look a lot more like the United States in their forms of kind of ephemeral identity?
Yes, yeah. I think this has to do with certain economic imperatives, and it has to do with the story about the 70s and 80s we tell ourselves is what has actually changed in elite mass relations? Can we still talk about something like mass? And the second question was also about the internet. The internet can't be explanatory for this trend. We should not attribute this overbearing causal power to the internet as somehow driving the entirety of the disengagement, because it means that you only look at the pull factor and not at the push factor. So, as I tried to say in the piece, the attraction of the internet, or the functional role of the internet, can only be understood, in a society in which a need has been created for a substitute for a certain form of social engagement that hadn't been possible. And I think the way that the internet gets sold in the early 2000s as a solution to the crisis of disengagement and abstentionism is very much the idea that people are leaving associations, they're leaving parts of civil society. But look, here is this different, more low cost, easier and more horizontal form of civil society online, which will actually be able to remedy some of the trends that we've identified in the real world out there. And I think the progressive stories of the 2010s, or one very powerful story, is a disillusionment with this digital dream that the internet could replace those older civic mores. Because what the internet does is indeed that it pulls people into this new simulated civil society, but it obviously does not promote the equivalent of the type of mass politics or the form of political engagement and militancy you still saw in the middle of the 20th century. And that was like omnipresent in the first half of the 20th century.
So one thing you point out is that one of the problems that a lot of leftists, particularly Marxists, are going to have with Putnam is he uses the concept of social capital. And he also uses what I consider a very American concept of social capital, as opposed to Pierre Bourdieu's version, which is a little bit more actual tied to actual capital. So, Pierre Bourdieu talks about social capital as a way of getting access to actual capital, whereas social capital for a lot of American sociologists who are using the concept is kind of divorced from any concern about, actual productive resources. So what do you think are the limits of the social capital model? And why do you think it's so alluring?
I think the version which Bourdieu presents, which has its issues, is actually still a pretty convincing interpretation. Because I do think the value of a left-wing civil society is indeed that it presents a form of social capital. But it doesn't mean that the workers aggregate that social capital to gain capital in themselves. No, it's because aggregate a certain form of social bond to engage in acts of power. Like once you overcome a free rider problem, you actually create capacities for collective action. That means you have a form of agency, or you can certainly influence events, or you can decide what an economy looks like in a way that is pretty rewarding. So in that sense, I'm more tempted to follow Bourdieu's interpretation than Putnam's. The issue with Putnam more is that he firstly individualizes the notion of capital to such an extent that social capital is something individuals possess and that is actually not properly relational. And the other is that this leads to an interpretation of what the uses of civil society affiliations or associational strength, which is very, I call it economistic, but economistic in a specific sense, insofar as it's about assuring yourself an individualized form of flourishing on a labor market in which collective action itself is impossible. So you can put your membership of a certain civil society group or your traineeship at a union, whatever, on a CV, and that will increase your job chances. So in that sense, it's adulterated version of human capital theory, basically. What do individuals or market participants need before they enter the labor market? Oh, maybe some associational bonds will look good for employers. And once the employers see that the person is engaged, then, well, they're more likely to get hired. And this is, I think, very explicit in a lot of college application procedures in the US, where why do some of the students engage in these civic acts? Well, because it'll look good on the application once you actually do it. And I think, unlike Bourdieu, that actually leads to a very limited understanding what associational strength could be and also what it once meant, and that he doesn't quite understand the function of why, for example, communists and Marxists were so interested in getting people into associations and building collective power. Because clearly the point there was not just to get people into elite colleges as such.
Yeah, I was thinking as we read this, one of the interesting things about this time versus, say, the early 20th century is we also could be tempted to say, well, oligarchical drift is what's driving a lot of this and leading to a lot of the segmentization. But I automatically go back to Robert Michel and think, well, yeah, but the last time that happened, what it actually produced was mass politics in the form of fascism, communism, and fighting in the streets. And so while the oligarchical tendencies seem to be there in our current society, you talk about it in your article, it's not manifest. The response to that, even if it manifests in quote populism, is not anything like the populism and the mass politics of the early 20th century.
No, I think it's very different because the Mitchell story is very much about a specific type of oligarchical drift, which is different from the one we're talking about now. This is how certain members in organizations gain predominance and start to dominate other members. But for that type of oligarchical drift, you need members in the first place. There needs to be a mass organization in which one group can dominate the other group within the organization, as Mitchell describes. Now, what we're seeing today is a form of oligarchical rule that doesn't even rely on mass membership, and it actually prefers not to engage in this membership model because it sees the cost as too high or too risky. Because once you have people inside the organization, they might actually pose demands that will impede your capacity to rule. And I'm just going to give an example you see in the British Labour Party with Keir Starmer now, is that the massive increase in membership that came after Corbyn, which turned out to be much more, I'd say, hyper political or identitarian or about identification with a leader figure rather than loyalty to a party or an ideology as such. Now this is seen as a burden. Like all the members that have joined are actually making it more difficult for Labour to prepare itself for government. So it wants to be seen as a more responsible party of capital, and it wants to do so without a radical base. And that means they're now actively not just encouraging people to leave, but actually pushing a lot of people out. And I think this shows the difference with the Mitchell story, where what Mitchell would imply is that the Labour Party has an elite and it has a mass membership, and the elite has a way of controlling the mass membership. That's not what Starmer is doing. What he's doing is actually getting rid of the mass membership because he finds it annoying to govern with the mass membership inside the party as such. And I would say, I mean, I'm not sure you agree with this, that's a very different kind of oligarchical drift from the one that Mitchell's was describing.
I I kind of see it as a flip side of the Mitchells one, where power has been so structurally diffuse that they don't need it anymore. In my example, darkly will actually come from U.S. unions, which article and in these times recently covered, and there's a little bit of a part of an article on Jacobin about this. Like we hear about this labor renewal, we hear about all this stuff that going on in labor, and I would actually say, subjectively speaking, not that you do have the increase of new unions. That's a fact. We do have more people in unions in the United States than we did before, but not relative to the size of the workforce has actually shrunk. But one of the things that Jacobin couldn't seem to figure out, and I forget the specific author, I shouldn't say Jacobin as a whole, but this author was like, why aren't unions acting on that right now when they are objectively materially better off? The leadership has a larger war chest from investments and from land ownership than has ever existed, despite having a smaller portion of the population in unions and most of that money not coming from dues. And my responsibility is, if they have more members, they have to use the money. So why would they do that? There's no, they can safely exist as is under a status quo with this financialization regime and not act, right? Well, that means that this mass organization has no incentive to actually be that much more mass. It's just not there.
No, there are a variety of constraints, or there are a variety of incentives for this type. I wouldn't call it rent-seeking behavior, but the type of
rent-preserving behavior maybe.
Rent-preserving. I mean, it's very reminiscent of what Michael Olson describes in the logic of collective action, where also the AFL, of course, in the 60s is not interested in organizing new workers, but now we've reached a stage where it becomes really quite tricky to break them out of this model, also because unions rightly feel under threat in the current economy that also holds in Europe. And they have, that is also part of the story, union bureaucracy to preserve. And they see themselves as purveyors of class peace to a hostile interest group that is not always clear that it wants to work with them as such. And that adds up to a general picture in which the reason for unions to expand their base is actually becoming much, much more difficult. One issue I have is that I don't think looking at unions is itself the best explanation or the best example of the trend we're trying to analyze, partly because unions are, certainly in the neoliberal era, have undergone such a heavy assault across the board. But what has actually happened to right-wing institutions? Why has the right not rekindled its civic base either? Surely if it would mean gaining electoral support, then there would be ample enough incentives for the right to maybe actually build up this kind of civic infrastructure. So wrecking the unions makes sense from capital's perspective. But the political representatives of capital, what Thatcher did with the Conservatives, namely that it kind of decimated the old mass organizations of the Tory party, that actually generates a lot of issues for the party elite as such, which now finds it much more difficult to buy consent in such a way. And then we have to ask the question, what is keeping the right from rebuilding its civic mores that the left is also not capable of?
Hmm. Well, what do you think is doing that? I guess, like, my question is similar. Well, like, churches are well invested. I mean, there's more. They actually have more financial problems than unions right now,
Yeah.
but they are well invested. They are pretty big landholders, and in the United States and in a lot of Europe, they don't pay taxes at all. So you would think they would be more robust. And like you said, there's no structural system capital to really come after them in the same
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And yet, from all things we can tell, that even if people identify as religious, they're dying. They seem to be spiraling in finances, tithing's down, um, you know, and the in America, the seeming partisan politicization of these religious institutions hasn't helped them at all, and they're motivating people to come back to church. It just isn't working.
No,
So,
absolutely not. Once again, I think there are push and pull factors here, and I'm going to weigh two hypotheses which I think are plausible. If you look at the British case again, with the Conservative Party, since Thatcher, there have been both push and pull factors that make the rebuilding of a mass Tory party extremely difficult and costly. Remember, the Tories are actually the first mass party in European history. They predate the SPD. They were very much a product of an attempt on behalf of conservative elites to make democracy safe, or make sure that once people actually got suffrage, they would not vote against the interests of elites as such. And the Conservative Party until the 50s, I think, actually had a larger mass membership than the Labour Party. So here we have a case of a Conservative Party that exceeds Labour in its organizational capacity. So, of course, has different IGRIs, different structures, but to say that this was not a mass organization seems very implausible to me. Now, what happens under Thatcher is double. She doesn't just initiate, of course, an attack on the unions, but she also is faced with a faction of capital that wants to lead American competition into the British economy, um, privatize and financialize all parts of the economy, and thereby create sociological chaos. And this actually decimates a lot of the classical basis of the Conservative Party in the electoral sense. So certain forms of the gentry, certain types of farmers, certain types of small banks. Once these massive American companies sweep into the British economy and they buy up all the small banks, or they begin to restructure agriculture, or they make certain forms of small scale banking impossible, well, this does mean that the economic base of your political base actually starts to disappear. So there is the active push factor where Thatcher opens the floodgates to foreign and mainly American capital, and this slowly begins to eat away at the political base they've built up for the party. That is a push factor, but I think the pull factor is just a generational change within the Tories, that many of the latest Tory voters or people who are within the party have grown up in a political culture that is just less anchored around mass engagement than that of their parents. So the alternatives to party power, or the very notion that you would permanently commit to the party because of a certain religious identity or because of a certain nationalism, has just become much more implausible for this generation. And I think this is like a pull factor where young people are not finding their way to conservatives partly because they have other stuff to do. Politics is a career, but if you don't get money out of it and if you can't make a career in it, then there's no reason to be invested in politics. That idealism just sounds a bit silly. Very few young people actually go into conservative politics purely of idealism still. Um, and together, that push and pull, I think, is a good explanation on why even the right finds it so difficult to rebuild its institutions. Partly because capital also wanted to get rid of the base in some sense. And secondly, people, even on the right, are now looking towards different things. So if you can just watch a mega preacher talk for 2 hours while you're doing chores in the house rather than actually driving somewhere to go to church, the costs are just vastly different, and the trade-off is very clear for many people, where they say, okay, then I'll just put YouTube on rather than getting in the car.
I mean, well, that's interesting to think about, like the megachurch phenomenon, because it already depersonalized and decommunalized religion. And one of the reasons why I think this trend has happened more slowly in Utah, which is, you know, fairly highly religious culture, but the church dogmatically actually insists on a ward system that is very diffuse and spread out and small, and has community functions that are tied into all sorts of things, including school, despite the separation of church and state. And so while it's still happening here, so we can't say that this has been successful at resisting it, it does seem to be massively slowed down compared to like even the Catholic Church in America, which is now the largest singular religious institution, but it's having all kinds of similar problems. Parish restructuring, parish failure, etc. And some of that can be blamed on particular scandals or whatever and lawsuits, but it doesn't, that by itself cannot explain what's going on. What I find interesting, you mentioned the work of GM Tomas, who I guess we should also mention as of when we're talking, has just very recently passed. So can you, how does Tomas's work relate to Putnam in your mind, and what can we draw by comparing them?
I think Tomas has a lot to say to it. The way I deploy him in the article, which comes from Telling the Truth About Class, which is this very famous, I think, epochal piece he wrote in 2006, in which he distinguishes these two traditions within 20th century socialism, one angelic and one demonic, is that his point about what 20th century socialism was, except, of course, for his powerful argument about the substitute bourgeois revolution, which we kind of know from Bordiga as well, is that it was in many ways a real competitor to the church. Now, what does it mean to be a competitor of the church? I think this can be taken in many ways, insofar as you're pro-secular, so you're trying to secularize a society that's still heavily religious. You're an economic competitor in that you're trying to decrease the economic power of the church. But I think also sociologically, the associational structure with which socialists worked in the 20th century just looked like a church. And Tamás has this really beautiful example where he describes these workers' lodgings, I think in Budapest around the turn of the century, describes their architecture. And he comes to the conclusion, if you're an alien visiting Earth for the first time, it would be impossible to distinguish a church from this institution. It is so obviously a religious entity with its own saint, with its own canon, with its own decalogue. And that doesn't mean they're, of course, the same ideology or the same worldview, but sociologically, they share a lot of the similarities. And you can even see this in the language that a lot of Marxists or socialists have deployed throughout the 20th century. It's no surprise that notions such as orthodoxy or heterodoxy or believers, etc., do resonate even on that side of the political spectrum because, yes, sociologically, they're very similar. And without going into bromides or very lazy thesis about Marxism as a substitute religion, this is the bad version of the argument I'm making. But I think the safer version is just to say that sociologically, or in terms of organizational density, socialists were able to build a similar kind of counter society or society within a society than the Catholic Church itself had. And what this also meant, I think, is that the types of political engagement those institutions can engage in, Tamás says, or the way they bind people to each other and the way they can inspire what he calls a super contractual commitment to certain forms of sacrifice. So overcoming certain short-term commitments and going for a really long-term commitment. And once that political culture disappears, once the, I'd say, basis of religiosity that was still there in socialism actually weakens, it also becomes much more difficult for socialists to actually build the types of institutions that can take on capital in a durable way. So again, this is a question of short-term versus long-term political strategy. What is very striking about the hyperpolitics we talk about is that it relies on these very frenetic moments of activity in which you can actually mobilize more people than ever have been mobilized. So once again, the BLM protests were numerically the biggest protests in American history. There have never been more people on the street in raw numbers. But the modes of affiliation that come with that type of mobilization are completely different from the church-like mobilization that socialists had in the 20th century. A friend of mine compared it to receiving a text message for a party late at night, going there, participating, and then leaving again, but you do so with no trace of your participation or no sign of your affiliation to the event you just participated in. And just to finish up, I think if you compare the 1963 March to Washington and the 2020 summer of protests, what you see is a very different, even photographic image. So everyone's in Washington with clothes that adorn their civil society affiliation, whether it's a union button, whether it's their membership of the NAACP. Everyone comes there launched by a certain civic infrastructure that set out the march itself. So if you look at the pictures of the march, a lot of people are there not anonymously or individually. They're there as part of organizations, whether it's labor unions, whether it's churches, whether it's African American associations, etc. Now, if you look at the pictures of BLM, except for some of the NGOs and some of the slogans which were generally shared, for the rest, it's an extremely serial and individualized crowd. They don't have an organizational infrastructure that's actually pushing their participation in that march. And I think there you can clearly see the massive shift in what civil society looks like.
Well, I mean, even in the NGOs, there's a hyper fragmentation. So, for example, like in here in Utah, we have 2 and at one time 3 different BLM organizations. No one. There's been many scandals with larger BLM organizations because no one knows where the money goes, who's accountable for them, and which one you're even donating to. So some have not had scandals, some have had them, but they all have the same name. It's such a fragmented landscape, even though it all ostensibly happened, as a reaction to 2 or 3 different movements. And yeah, it hasn't really created. It's not like these BLM organizations have coalesced and become a political movement. They have fractured more and more, and seemingly become less and less part of the political discourse at all. For a little while, I think I was ironically hearing more about BLM stuff from labor in Britain than I was from any formal party in the United States, and I was very confused by this. I must admit that I was like, well, yeah, in so much that you have racial problems, your racial problems aren't our racial problems. They're different in the UK. Your entire history is different. Why are you using our talking points? And then it occurred to me oh, this is brand useful, but it also is not going to lead to a mass base in Britain because it just wouldn't. And so it's sort of a an ideological gloss for kind of politics, but it's also a politics without a whole lot of risk of even being attractive.
Well, it's not just the heavy focus on discourse. I do think there is a sense in which these movements, if you're willing to call them that, can have an effect on public opinion. I think attitudes on a variety of racial questions have shifted under the influence of these movements. So I wouldn't completely discount what they do. It's just what goals they set themselves and what they can actually fulfill. But it's very striking, the similarity with something like a hashtag, which is this floating signifier that can be taken up by any given individual and then pronounce a certain allegiance to this message, but there is no central organ or authority that can actually determine the meaning of this floating signifier, that can actually give it content. Everyone just has to fill it in themselves. And I think Theodore Skocpol has this nice phrase about NGOs as sort of heads without bodies or advocacy without members. What's very typical about NGOs, even when they have a lot of funds, is that they do so not by attracting dues-paying members, but by basically looking mainly for private donors. So in that sense, they almost structurally rely on not building out a mass base, because having the mass base might mean you have potential conflicts between donors and members as well. And in that sense, the NGOs, once again, are just not structurally similar to anything we saw in associational life in the 20th century.
So, what are your theories as to why this is happening? But if we find Putnam's particular version of social capital not particularly persuasive, we agree with his observations, but we don't have a theoretical construct as to why it's happening, that we can just simply say, oh, it's the fragmentation of capital, because it's also affecting things that it doesn't make that much sense that capital would want to fragment, or you know.
Yes, I think this is an extremely contentious question. What I'm going to say is very hypothetical, and I'm very open to any other suggestions. And I have to think harder about this before I reach a more definitive judgment. Um, I don't want to sound reductively materialist, but I do think a proper materialist explanation would have to look at the exact chronology of the decline of sociality, and it's very closely tied, if you look at all the numbers, with the crisis of the 70s and 80s. There is a civilizational turning point then, which probably has to do with not just the inflationary problem, but a general attempt or a general restructuring within capitalist societies, of which we're still seeing the ripple off effects. Now, if you start with the long downturn and the decline in profitability in the early 70s, there are two ways in which this affects the two factors within capitalist society, both capital and labor. The decline of economic growth, and there's good material on this, makes certain types of civil society organizing much more difficult. So it's very clear that unions and other associations also have to be funded. They require and dues paying members. Those members need wages, and they need to be able to cut off a slice of those wages to donate to the organization. Once economic growth slows down, it actually becomes more difficult, certainly for labor, to keep its own civil society running. You clearly see this also with the Panthers or all kinds of women's rights organizations. Once the money dries up, it's more difficult to finance or irrigate a certain civil society. Now, what this does on the side of capital, and here I think we have a much more powerful explanation, is that the fall in profitability creates a dilemma in capital as to what it's supposed to do to restore profit rates. What are the potential strategies they have to deploy for profit rates? In the 70s, there are a variety of responses to this that also differ from national cases. But I think what most capitalist classes settle on in the course of the 70s is a theory which is very well expressed by Samuel Huntington in the Trilateral Commission in the middle of the 70s, where it's the very hold of a certain civil society, both right wing and left wing, that explains why profitability is not being restored. So it's not just an explanation of the inflationary threat of workers making too high wage demands, but also a way of explaining why precisely this return to profitability is impossible. Now, to restore it, capital has to initiate an attack on left-wing civil society. Not just break its hold on the state, but also pulverize it so it can cut the wage bill and make sure that its own profit margins are restored. The issue is simply, and I think this you clearly see with Thatcher, is that once you do this controlled demolition or this open offensive on left-wing civil society, that's inevitably going to have repercussions for other parts of civil society as well. So once you give capital the chance to invade society to such an unprecedented degree, that's also going to have atomizing effects on the right. And once that central operation is in place, so economic downturn makes it more difficult for labor to organize. Capital goes on the counteroffensive and detonates its own civil base and the left-wing civil base. I think you clearly see this in the case of the discussions around the Volcker shock. Well, what's happening is like, oh, there's too much money going around and people are continuing to lend. It's because there's all these interest groups that are clamoring for more and more loans. What we just need to do is do a hard cut and make sure that this doesn't continue. Then you have this big bang. And then in the 80s and 90s, I think what steadily happens is that elites realize that they've undertaken a very dangerous operation, that now buying consent of the masses might actually become more tricky. And they start constructing all kinds of alternatives for people to survive or without civil society. So they individualize society and then they say, okay, here are options or ways to survive if you're so heavily individualized. And that model is, I think, the one that crashes in 2008 when this credit-based growth model actually runs into its limits. And I think we've been living in the aftermath of the expiry of that particular solution to the civil society crisis that has ushered in populism, which is now creating hyperpolitics, which actually I don't think has created a renaissance in organizational activity either. That is the most convincing account I've been able to come up with, hopefully sufficiently materialist. But once again, I think there are loads of holes in the argument that still need plugging.
I am the hyperpolitic thesis is something that I am increasingly interested in, but I've told you that I see hyperpolitics as weirdly also anti-political in the proper sense, because it does not produce political organizations, and even when it does, those organizations are still very much, for reasons that I sometimes I don't even understand, addicted to, like, trying to convince someone on the left, for example, that you need to take over school boards uh, to build a low political base or something. It seems impossible for them to conceive. It's like we start building the movement. I mean, this is literally the argument of most American leftists: is we need the national political build victory to build the movement, which I'm like, but that's the opposite of how politics works historically. And if I take that at face value, that's a circular argument. Like we need to have a political victory, which requires the movement to build the movement, of which we could have a political, like, that doesn't make any sense. But I realized it's not, we're not the only people who think that way. Like that, you see that um, on the right, even though the right does have more, you know, attempts at, like, for example, school board taking over, doing quasi grassroots politics. Uh, that's actually really hard to maintain. And even when it has money, it tends to become, quote, astroturfed very, very quickly, and abandon any, like, localist slow build priorities pretty quick. So yeah, that's just an observation. It's not really, I think I, like you, I feel like your outline feels correct to me, but also there's a whole lot missing. Um, and it would be several books to probably figure out. But it what I find interesting about that is, to me, the Latin American case is what's interesting. Okay, yeah, Europe would be Americanized for reasons of its, part of the great post Bretton Woods transatlantic social compact, of which, you know, we kind of, American capital's like, fine, you can have your little bits of social democracy as long as you keep it in particular spots and shut up. Um, but Latin America, and this also seeming like this seemed, when I was reading Bowling Alone, or like, I think about there's a tension in Korea that's generational. When I lived in Korea, where despite being a pretty atomized society, there's still a lot of social forces that push people together. But when I was living there 13, 14 years ago, those were beginning to break down. Um, and I find that interesting, because that means that that it looks like it's a tendency of capital in general, not just a local specific, like, remediation. It's not specific to, like, the United States or to the Euro American Social Compact or whatever.
No, it's definitely general, and I think this is what I also recognize in Putnam, is this is not just an exclusively American story. And the point about Americanization is that America just offers a distant mirror to those other cases that explains why they're moving in that direction. Um, I don't want to depersonalize it too much, because I do think, for example, if you look at anti-union laws or whatever, uh, certain forms of anti-civil legislation, there is an active attempt to make it more difficult for people to associate. But at the same time, you don't want to have too personalized or too conspirationist a version of the process we're describing. Is that there's also an impersonal element to it, where the more market dependent a society becomes and the more mediated by the money form, the less certain types of social association actually seem like a necessity to certain people. There is a way of living certain lives outside of associations that don't necessarily mean you have to reproduce yourself within those associations. They don't even require sort of nasty capitalists to compile anti-union laws. There is a more organic, or I'd say more personalist process there, which actually makes it likely or very unlikely for people to associate in the ways they still did in the 19th and the 20th century. So the very dream that the right has that people can go back to church on Sunday seems as fanciful as some of the projects you see in the left, insofar as I don't think they're not going to do that out of nothing. Constitutively, you're dealing with a different anthropology, almost a different species than the one that actually was alive in the previous centuries.
Right. And this is where, like, the J.D. Vance exclamation that it's too much porn and too much, whatever. I mean, that's his, like, I mean, there's a funny thing that he says in that book, Hillbilly Elegy, a book that I am actually more ambivalent about than a lot of leftists. Is full of right-wing crap, but I actually felt it was a fairly honest description of, like, Rust Belt Upper South life. But yeah, I mean, he says something like, well, of course they're not gonna go to church on Sunday, they're too busy looking at porn. And I'm like, in some ways that's true, but that to me is more a description and not an explanation of what is going on.
No, why are they watching porn? You can't just assume that the one is more attractive than the other. That is in itself an open question.
Porn.
Yes, it has always existed. Well, I'm willing to accept. Yeah, I'm willing to accept that the availability has increased. That's undeniable. But there's certainly something else that's also driving it as such.
Yeah, I mean, it's, we talk about the paradox of a generation in the United States, and this is true in Europe too, who's grown up with access to pornography, but seems largely desexualized, not hypersexualized. Exactly. That is not something anyone would have one-to-one predicted, and something that I think a lot about. I mean, I tend to do my sloppy, well, it's all alienation, and this is advanced capitalism, so it's advanced alienation. But that's not actually an explanation, because if I just call it alienation, even though I think that's real, that is just me naming the problem. It's not actually explaining the mechanism of the problem. So
I have to think a lot harder about this, but I do think alienation is a good place to start once you start rendering that more concrete. Because I do think we're now dealing with I'm going to use a very suspicious term, a human type that has a certain experiential capacity that makes certain certain types of long-termism very difficult. I think there's even good psychological research on this, where the death of the future, the inability to plan, the prevalence of certain forms of depression, the prevalence of other kinds of mental illnesses, all boil down to a really steep decline in capacity to think long-term, both collectively and individually. And once you come at this holistic theory and you actually connect it to the mutation of capitalism as a social form, I think you might be able to construct a very plausible theory that will get you Putnam and Marx together, rather than just saying, "Oh, it's bad."
Yeah, it's alienation. It's bad. Which that's my thing, because if I was just talking about, oh, we're in desocialization, I actually do sound like, you start talking about the Robin Partner problem, you sound like a conservative unless you give a pretty rigorous, materialist explanation for why it's going on.
Yes. Yeah, and this was part of the challenge of my article, is that I very much didn't want to fall into that trap where I lock myself in for having to explain something with purely cultural or sort of purely psychological factors, but which at the same time doesn't discount them either. I do think they interact once you get the materialist dimension in there. Yeah, I have to get going. I'm so sorry.
Yep. No, that was my last question. Thank you so much, Anton, for coming on. And I will link the article that you wrote for Jacobin in the show notes. Is there anything else you'd like to plug?
Well, there's a piece coming out on hyperpolitics, which is kind of expanding on the thesis I set out last year, which I'll send over to you as well, and which
Okay.
is the point, and which actually tries to make explicit just what was mass politics, what was post politics, and what was specific about hyperpolitics, or what periodization would help us when we talk about the last 50 years. But yeah, so it's again a hypothesis, but I'm interested what you might make of it and other readers might make of it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be looking forward to reading it. Thank you so much.
Okay. See you, man. Thanks again.
See you. Bye.